Okay, so here's part two. If you haven't seen it, I did a quick video, kind of introduction of what we got going on with this little Samurai. So here's part two. Got it up on jack stands, got the wheels off, and to get started, first thing, drain the oil. This thing didn't have much oil in it. So get the oil drained, and then I'm gonna pull the 10 millimeter bolts off the hub dial. That'll come off. Underneath this is a snap ring on the end of the axle shaft. And then we're gonna pull these 6 12 millimeter headed bolts to get the whole locking hub off. We'll see what happens. This hub is apparently not working on this. The owner says it's pretty rusty inside. Sometimes when that happens, you go to pull this dial off, there's a spring between the dial and I don't know what its technical name is, but it's like the coupler that goes in to connect the axle shaft to the hub, or pulls out to separate them for two-wheel drive. Sometimes when they're rusted, when you go to pull this off, the sliding piece is stuck from the rust, and really the only connection it has to take it apart is through a spring, and if you pull too hard, you can break it off the spring, and they're kind of a pain to put back together. So I will show that when I get to it. So kind of the quick order here. Get it up, get the wheels off, drain the oil, pull the caliper off. There's two 17 millimeter bolts here. You pull those, the whole caliper comes off, and then tie it up out of the way so it's not hanging from the brake line. And then you pull the hub, or the locking hub apart, and it's two separate main pieces. And then the rotor can come off to get out of the way, and then you'll have access to the wheel bearings. So you'll pull there's a nut, a lock nut, a retainer ring, and the main nut against the bearing. You pull those all off, and then the whole wheel hub can slide off. And then after that is the spindle snout. It's actually kind of like basically like a tube that the wheel bearings ride on, and then the axle shaft passes through the center of it. You pull that off, then you can slide the axle shaft out. And then you pull the seal. There's 8 bolts around the back of this for the knuckleball seals. You pull those off, and then you got the Kingpins, and then basically got that whole end off. And then same thing for the other side. So you've got to basically go through that whole process to be able to get the third member out, because the axle shaft's passing through, and inside of it, it can't come out because of the axle shafts. And so you've got to disassemble all of this stuff just to get the third member out. Something on my race car Samurai I've done that simplifies this process a little bit for maintenance is I get rid of these dust shields, and I'm going to talk to the owner of this Samurai and see if that's something he wants to do. If you get rid of these dust shields, then basically you pull the caliper off, and then you have room to get a 14 millimeter wrench in here, and you can pull the spindle snout loose, and this whole unit will come off together. You still have to take the dial off and get that snap ring, but that's quick and easy, and it's not like a big greasy mess. But getting in here with that 14 wrench and taking the spindle snout free of the knuckle allows you to take this off as a unit and not disturb the wheel bearings. And so if your wheel bearings are, properly maintained and still tight and whatever, and you don't want to get into that mess, you can just take the whole thing off. And there's a big benefit to that, because when you go to these RCV axles, these are the best in the business. There's no comparison. But the one thing you've got to do with these every so often, and I don't remember the exact interval. I'll look at the instructions and update that when I get to this part. But you need to re-grease these every so often. It's probably like for an average person, probably once a year or something. So you basically just gotta slide these out, and repack this with grease. And this is literally, I mean, people call these a burr field, and there's a lot of names. It's literally, it's a 6-ball style CV joint. Like, it's in basically, you know, all front wheel drive cars, you know, side by sides. It's just a CV joint. But RCVs, you know, they're US made, super high quality. I believe they're 300M material. And they are last I checked, they have a lifetime warranty. When I bought mine, being that I'm kind of pushing the limits with this size of axle, I called the company to see what the warranty was all about. And I was told basically if you break this due to torque, they cover it. You know, if you're on the gas hopping in the rocks and you twist a shaft off, they'll replace it. If you crash into a tree and rip a knuckle off or something, you know, obviously that's outside of the warranty, but good investment. You know, they're expensive, but they're worth it. You know, and then this is the differential side. This is 26 spline, whereas the factory axles neck down and are a 22 spline. So that's why, and you know, in the first part I showed I have 2 rear lockers to put into this rig, because the rear axles are 26 spline and factory fronts are 22, but these being more heavy duty go to 26, and therefore you need 26 spline differential. Okay, well, I'm gonna get set up and I will get the camera on a tripod and show you the disassembly of all this stuff here. Okay, luckily this came apart pretty easy. Maybe it's the driver's side that was rusty. So this is the style snap ring pliers you need. They're not the pin. These snap rings have kind of a pointed end, not the little rings. And you see it's got pointed ends, and then this guy's got little gripper teeth. You can just get in there and spread it apart. That came apart pretty easy. See if this little gun's got enough power for these. Oh yeah. Yeah, some of these were loose. When you have a locker, these 6 hub bolts are definitely a maintenance item. All the power from the differential goes through the end of the axle shaft into this shiny body, the hub body, and that power gets into the wheel hub through these 6 little 8mm bolts. This Samurai with this size of tire, I imagine will be okay with these, as long as he keeps up on them. I recommend every trip retorquing these, because they can come loose, and once they come loose, they'll break. This thing will have a little play, and then it can hammer them and break them. So now, pull the wheel bearings loose. Actually, I gotta do this next. I forgot to do the caliper. Pull the hubs loose. One of my favorite things about Samurais is really how few tools it takes to work on them. With a 10, a 12, a 14, 17, and 19, you can basically take apart the entire car. See this this little guy was needing some maintenance. You can see that in the camera. You know, none of this is solid. You know, this is all staying put, but the hub is loose, so the wheel bearings are really sloppy. And they sound awful. All right, so up next, I'm gonna get the tools together to pull all this apart and show you how it goes. Okay, so now under this nut, there's a plate with like little wings sticking out, little tabs. It's gonna be impossible to do this without blocking the view, but you take a small chisel and push those away. There's usually two. And I usually will feel all 6 sides, because there's a whole bunch of those tabs on that. People can bend over as many as they want, really, that line up. And then I'll usually take the socket and kind of tap it on too. That'll push the tabs. That'll push the tabs out of the way. So there's one. And then here's that little retainer. So it's got the threaded spindle snout has a keyway groove. And then this has a keyway to prevent this from rotating on the spindle. And then the little tabs keep the nut locked to the spindle so it can't come loose. And it's the same size socket. I don't know the metric size of this. This is a 2-inch socket. It doesn't fit perfectly, but it fits good enough. So now, there's one more kind of a washer. Sometimes it's stubborn to get out. There it goes. There it goes. There's one more washer that has another little tang to go into that keyway groove. And this just kind of, if the bearing were to spin, the inner race of the bearing were to spin on the race, this, you know, basically will just isolate that rotation from the nuts. I mean, ideally you don't want that bearing to spin ever, but this would keep it from trying to either loosen or tighten that nut, further exacerbating your issue there. Sometimes these can be stubborn to come off, especially if stuff is rusty inside. These are pretty chewed up. Part of this job, I'm also replacing these, so I'm not worried about being too careful with them. So this is the end of the axle shaft. When I was showing those RCVs a minute ago, you know, this is the end of the CV side. Boy, this guy's on there. I'm gonna pause a minute and get some different tools together. Okay. So I tried prying and a couple other things, but this definitely has had some water in it. There it goes. Ooh. We might be looking for a new spindle. This is kind of chewed up. So I'm not a big fan of playing in the mud. But if that's what you're into, this stuff, you gotta get used to this process because you gotta pull this stuff apart pretty often to clean it and maintain it. I mean, it didn't have a lot of grease in there to start with, but I don't know. Hopefully, sometimes when wheel bearings get left, unmaintained for a long time, the outer race that's lightly pressed into this can spin, and once that happens, your hub is basically junk. So I'm gonna get this cleaned up and then knock those races out and see how it looks. I mean, basically this little paper gasket is that gasket and this seal are your only defense against water. And if you can see, it's real thin between the bolts. And usually these things are pretty, Samurais are pretty old now, and who knows how many times this has been apart. So it's a good idea to check these out and make sure all the seals are good. And if you do play in the mud or the water a lot, a thin coating of an RTV of some sort is not a bad idea on either side of this paper gasket. All right, so up next is, I didn't bring the tools out, 14 millimeter. For those, there's these 4 bolts here, and that holds the dust shield on, as well as the spindle snout holds that to the knuckle body. So hang on one sec. Okay, so I didn't really plan ahead and grab all the tools ahead of time like I should have. But once I get this all apart, I will lay out all the tools and show what's needed, for this job. There's nothing special. Really, the only thing that's remotely special is this style of snap ring plier. But for years, you can get in there with 2 little blade screwdrivers and pop it loose too. Where there's a will, there's a way, but those make it a lot easier. So here's just the disc brake dust cover. I toss these. One thing you need to do though, so this is 2 pieces still, they're just stuck together. So you've got the caliper bracket, and then this is the spindle snout. I got to get this cleaned up and see if it's any good. And here's your axle. Oh, so, lost track of what I was trying to say. So if you decide to get rid of these, this thickness needs to be there still, otherwise it throws off the alignment of the caliper onto the rotor. So what I do is I cut this. Some people will use a washer, but I found it was easier just to cut this, and I leave a little bit of length out on the sides so I can hold it in there, because once you pull the 2 caliper bolts loose, those shims will just fall, and that's why the washers can be a pain. If you make this one nice long rectangular piece, then you can hold it in there while you fish in the bolts, and it just makes life a lot easier. But as you can see, with the rotor sitting right here, there's no access to these bolts. Once this is gone, you can get a wrench in behind the rotor and pull these 4 bolts, and then that whole unit will come off in one piece. And then you can get in and pull your axle shafts out. And once a year, re-grease your good axles. So something to look at when you do this. If this is full of 90 weight, there's a seal at the end of the axle tube that the axle shaft rides in. Right here on this surface. If this has got 90 weight in it, that seal's bad. This should only have grease. Some people completely fill that with grease. I don't. Since I have the RCVs that need to be maintained fairly often, I pack the joint and I keep this basically open and clean and just put it in there. That's just what I do. The RCVs take a kind of expensive grease, and to pack that whole ball full of grease, it doesn't do anything. It just needs to be in the joint. I will take a little grease and spread it on the knuckle ball where the seals ride, just to lubricate the seals, but having this filled with grease, in my opinion, doesn't really do any good. If you're a mud bogger, packing this full of like a waterproof grease isn't a bad idea, because if this is completely full of grease, there's really not space for the water to get in. But I don't know, I'm more of a keep it maintained often kind of guy, instead of trying to do something like filling it with grease. It just makes maintenance down the road so much easier and cleaner. And again, it's just really a waste of grease. There's no real reason for it, but that's just my opinion. Everybody's got their own opinion. Another spot that does need a little grease is this surface rides on a bushing on the back of this, so that needs a little bit of grease on it, but not a lot. All right, so that's the disassembly of this side for the most part. Now all that's left is pulling the seal off the back. There's 8 10mm headed bolts, and then there's 8 12mm headed bolts to pull the Kingpin caps off, and then this whole knuckle, as well as this, will come off. We gotta pull the tie rod as well. So I'm gonna take a break, get cleaned up a little bit, and then show you that. Okay, so something I should have mentioned a second ago. If you're only getting into your differential and you're not fully rebuilding your axles, this is as far as you need to go. Once you can pull that axle shaft out, you're done. If you need to change that seal, you're gonna have to pull this off. It's a whole lot easier to change it with the knuckle off. But if you're only getting into your diff to install a TRE locker, this is as far as you gotta go. Once you can get that axle shaft out, and same on the other side, now the differential is free to be pulled out. But this Samurai has not been owned for a long time by the current owner, so he wants to go through everything just to make sure it's solid. And by the look of those wheel bearings, I don't know that anything's, I wouldn't trust anything. So I pulled the cotter pin, pull that castle. Don't ever use pickle forks to separate these. Pull the nut, and if you're a good aim with the hammer, whoops. Try not to hit the tripod. By giving the end of that a good hit, it'll distort it, and it'll spring back, and then that'll pop out. That way you don't damage the boot. If you're not a real good aim with a hammer, I suggest keeping the nut on loosely, but I've done this a million times. I'm not really big into spending huge money on tools, but some snap-on tools are definitely worth it. These snap-on hammers, it's a dead blow. It's full of shot. I don't know if you can hear that. It's a dead blow, but it has that metal face. These things hit like no one's business. Definitely worth the money. I've had this hammer for, I don't know, 10, 15 years. Doesn't get used a lot, but they're awesome. So get that out of the way. Like I said, there's 8 10 millimeter, or am I wrong? No, they're 12 millimeter. 12 millimeter head bolts back here. And don't lose these. These are kind of a funky little bolt. They have a little shoulder. So it's got, the threads are narrower than that little shoulder. That shoulder goes through the seal pack. So if you lose these, you've got to get the right bolt. Don't just put a regular bolt in its place. Two of these bolts actually function as the steering stops too. And I've noticed that those ones do tend to come loose. So it's a pretty good thing to keep an eye on. I can't get to all these. I gotta grab a wrench. This thing is tons of crusted grease and dirt on all these. It's another reason why I'm not a big fan of packing this full of grease. If this cavity is relatively clean, you're going to notice a 90 weight gear oil leak from a bad seal a lot sooner. I like to take the open end of the wrench if it's all crusted over with grease and dirt, and you can wiggle it through and kind of break it off. That way the closed end gets on it easier. If you're just getting started on working on cars, ratchet wrenches are a must. And so I've got all the bolts loose. There's basically, get this apart. So there's 2 steel half circles, and then they grip down on a, it's like a felt type material. I'll show this in a lot better detail to all the new parts. Most of the good kits come with everything. They even come with new steel pieces. You can see there's kind of a papery steel, felt gasket, and then a rubber gasket, and then these metal rings. Basically a set of rings go on first, and then the gaskets, and then the outer rings. And again, I know the camera angle is terrible. I'll show this a lot more clearly when I put the new ones on. That way it's clean parts and it's easier to see. So now the only thing holding this knuckle on is the Kingpins. And so there's tapered roller bearings similar to wheel bearings on the top and bottom of this. And this feels a little crunchy. They tend to wear the most in the center position. You can see how this is pretty loose in the center position. As you turn, it kind of tightens up. That's pretty normal because your car spins most of its time in the straight ahead position. But luckily, these can get loose, and sometimes it's kind of difficult if you jack up your car and your wheel is rocking. You've got to determine, is it the wheel bearings loose or is it these bearings that are loose? It can be either one or both. There's really nothing special about these bolts. On my race car, not for any real reason, just I went to a higher strength bolt because this lower one, if you jump or whatever, this lower one does see a lot of force. So I upgraded to some stronger bolts. So when you pull these out, there's shims, and they can be stuck to the knuckle or stuck to this. And after 30, 40 years, sometimes it's hard, but you need to keep track of all of that. It's even a good idea to keep track of which one of these, technically these are identical, these caps, or trunnions, I think they're technically called. But I try to keep them, put them back where they came from, as well as the orientation. They're supposed to be concentric, but I have heard that floating around are some aftermarket like alignment correction ones that would have that pin offset to correct a bent housing or what other issue there might be, because there's no adjustment on these front ends for camber. The camber is set by just how this housing is built. So some companies do build some different stuff to help fix issues like that. So anyway, pull these out, set them in a way you can put them back in place. That one's tight. Top one's tight. A big source of problem with Samurais, also from mud and water, is that lower bearing is basically the lowest point of this empty housing. And so any water that gets in here is going to settle the bottom, and it's going to basically fill that bottom bearing with water. And I've taken these apart before where the bearings were just totally rusted out. There it goes. So there you can see, there's the shim. The shims are to adjust the height of these trunnions. And so basically, the smaller diameter goes through the bearing, and then this shoulder pushes on the bearing. So here's the bearing. And so by taking shims away or having thinner shims, this is going to push lower and put more preload on that bearing. You know, 'cause there's a specified preload that this is supposed to have. And I don't know it off the top of my head, I have to look it up. And when I put these back together, I'll explain that better. But basically use like a fishing weight scale, and you hook it to the steering arm and you pull it, and there needs to be some resistance to this turning. So, I mean, that's basically it as far as the teardown. You know, these bearings are going to get tossed. The bearing race, this is so covered in grease it's hard to see. This bearing race will get hammered out, top and bottom, and new ones will be put in. And then I'm guessing this, I don't know, seems a little oily, but maybe not, but I'm changing these seals anyway. There's a lot of good kits out there, low range off-road, Trail Tough, Zooks Off-Road, pretty much all the Suzuki specialty companies. They've all got nice kits that gives you basically every seal and every bearing for the entire axle housing. Wheel bearings, Kingpin bearings, you know, all the hub dial, the hub body, those seals, the seal at the back of the hub, the knuckle ball seals, the inner axle seal, everything. It doesn't give you anything for the differential, but basically from here out on both sides. Pretty good value. Watch out, get good ones that come with good Japanese bearings. There are some cheaper kits out there that use cheap stuff. I highly recommend the ones that come with like the good Koyo or SKF bearings. And that's basically it. You know, I'm not gonna film doing the other side. It's exactly the same process. So I'm gonna get that knocked out, and then I will get this stuff all cleaned, and then we will resume when I'm putting all the new parts together. Well, I think I'm gonna wrap up the second part of this series on this rig right here. So I'm gonna get this taken apart on both sides, cleaned up, all the parts cleaned up, and then we'll come back together with installing all these new parts when everything's clean and ready to go. So you can see here, this is the kit. This is the trail gear kit. With all the knuckle seals, you know, the retainer plates, the hub seals, inner axle seals. It even gives you new hardware for the wheel bearings, new nuts. These things, you know, over the years, people will remove these with a hammer and a chisel and crescent wrench, pipe wrench, whatever. And these things are usually pretty chewed up, so it's nice having new hardware. So inner and outer wheel bearings. These are the Kingpin bearings. The proper gaskets for the hubs. So it's a good way to go. Basically gives you everything you need in one box, so you're not having to source any of this stuff by itself. Because I mean, you just go to an auto parts store, they'll get you $10, $20 for a set of these. You know, in AutoZone or somebody, they're not gonna know what this is. And especially this stuff. Where are you gonna find? Yeah, it's the way to go. And it's nice to, you know, especially some of the smaller companies. I'm a big fan of Trail Tough. They're in Medford, Oregon. I use them a lot. You know, it's not like this giant, you know, chain type company or whatever. Like, I'm a big fan of supporting the smaller companies that do a nice job, and Trail Tough really does. Trail Gear, I've had good luck with their stuff as well. They've kind of grown to be kind of a huge company, buying up a bunch of others. I'm not a big fan of that, but whatever. So yeah, so that basically wraps this up. I'm gonna put up a video with part 3 with getting all this nasty stuff cleaned up and going back together. This is definitely way more work than doing the rear. The rear, I mean, is a fraction of the work. You basically got 4 nuts on the back of that backing plate. You pull off and the axle slides out and you pull the diff out. I'm going to cover it all, but if you can pull this off, this is the hardest stuff for sure. And it's nothing. It's easy. I'll show this better when everything's cleaned up, but I mean, you can see there's not a lot of stuff involved in doing this. I mean, it looks worse than it is, because it's a mess, but yeah, a handful of sockets, you know, literally nothing special, no specialty tools. Really, that snap ring, like I said, is about the only thing that's kind of a luxury. It could be done with two small screwdrivers. You know, and again, that's one of my favorite things about these Samurais is they're so easy to work on. If you're new to, you know, the automotive hobby lifestyle or whatever, 70s and 80s Japanese rigs, to me, are the height of automotive engineering. They were really well made, really simple, and for the most part, pretty friendly to the mechanics. Stuff is easy to work on. So they're a nice rig to learn these skills with. And Samurais especially, because there's enough following that, I mean, these, I don't know what year this one is. It's an 86 or an 87. I mean, it's old, and you can literally buy every piece of this car you need. You get into some of the older Toyota pickups and stuff, and they're getting hard to find parts for. So that's a cool thing about the Samurais. And, you know, they're just fun. Anybody that's ever driven a Samurai in the summertime, the top off and doors off, it's just fun, you know. That's what it comes down to. So thanks for watching. I'll part 3 soon and finish this project up. Thanks for watching. Okay, real quick, I'm tearing apart the other side. This is basically what you don't want to see. So that's a big old puddle of 90 weight inside the knuckle. And it was something I've never seen before. Usually the felt seal and stuff on the back will leak out before this gets like crazy full. But as soon as I pulled the hub, the locking hub body off of the actual wheel hub, you know, once I pulled the locking hub off of there, oil started pouring out through the wheel bearings, which I've never seen before. Pretty funny, but so yeah, this side's a mess. It's got lots of caked on dirt. I'm gonna have to scrape off and clean, and because I'm gonna try to make these knuckles look, you know, as clean, as new looking as I can when I put it back together. So this is kind of some of the stuff you don't want to see. So that seal in there is definitely blown, and that would explain why I maybe got a half a quart of oil when I drained it. So anyway, just thought I'd share that. Back to work. Okay, so I went ahead, I got the other side all apart, got both axle shafts out. I pulled all of the third member bolts. So the seal against the housing is silicone, and they can be glued in there pretty good. So instead of going crazy with trying to hammer screwdrivers in there or anything stupid, I just put my jack under there and just carefully grab just the flange, try not to hit that dust seal, and then just give it some pressure and just watch the bottom until you get it just separates, and then you can wiggle them out of there. You don't want to push up super hard and get the thing cocked in there, because you could jam it, because it's a relatively precise fit where it goes into the case. It's got like a little, you know, machined kind of like a pilot. but just push it until it just cracks the bottom, and then you can climb under there and wrestle the thing out of there. So the next step is I'm going to get that out and get the third member up on the bench, and then we'll start doing the actual locker install.